The Weird Autumn update added quite a few interesting things to Night in the Woods. There are several new minor characters, including the Navy recruiter and the newspaper guy, extra songs like Cycles and Space Dragon, and a couple of new minigames, such as the water balloon toss and the fortune teller at Harfest. It even added a couple of cut side quests, like the trip to Jenny's field with May's mom and the visit to Germ's house, where his grandma drops some tantalizing references to May's fate and echoes the dying words of her grandfather. And if you're looking for more information on the all-important patriarch of the Borowski family, then you're in luck, because Weird Autumn also introduced Miss Rosa, a character whose entire purpose is to provide some backstory on May's grandfather. Through Miss Rosa, May learns more about who her grandfather was as a person, transforming him from the almost mythological figure he is at the start of the game to someone far more human, and better understands how his past intersects with her present. But before I go on, if you are a Night in the Woods fan, then please be sure to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me with a YouTube channel membership or over on Patreon. My dream is to make these videos full-time someday, and by doing any of those things, you'll be helping make that dream a reality. May can find Miss Rosa for the first time on day 2, down in the trolley tunnel. She calls out to her by name, and though our protagonist has no idea who she is, she explains that she knew her grandfather, and even came to see her the day after she was born. She then promises to tell May more about her grandfather, so long as she continues to visit her. For those of us who played the original version of the game back before Weird Autumn dropped, this was pretty groundbreaking. May's grandfather was practically a ghost in OG Night in the Woods, pun intended, so the promise of finding out more about him was quite the tease, and made Miss Rosa someone I prioritized talking to in this new edition. From there, May can talk to Miss Rosa every other day, on exactly the same cycle as Mr. Chazikov. On day 4, she'll touch on the deep lore of the Borowski family, that May had an ancestor who was around for the really hard times, back when the workers of Possum Springs had to stand up against armies. This is a clear reference to Arthur Borowski, who, as we know from the newspaper articles in the library, was a prominent member of the Union. In other videos, I've gone as far as to speculate that he might have been a survivor of the explosion in Stafford Mine, that he may have been the first person in her family to have the glimmer, and that he likely was a founding member of the Tooth Society. Much of that speculation has its roots in what Miss Rosa tells us here, and as I'll discuss in greater detail later on, it provides a generational weight to May's struggle with the cult. Miss Rosa also says that they were there to, quote, watch the tide roll out, and as we'll see on day 8, this is her way of saying that although the Union won some big battles in the early 1900s, the bad bosses came back with a vengeance eventually. This is, unfortunately, what happened in the real world as well. After some of those groundbreaking victories, the power of unions waned over time, to the point where they have significantly less teeth today than they did at the turn of the century. On day 6, Miss Rosa shares a bit about what May's grandfather was like as a person. She says that he was prone to low moods, which indicates that he probably suffered from depression, along with tremendous bursts of energy. All of this aligns him with May, and the mental health struggles she experiences throughout the game. It's on day 8 that Miss Rosa tells us the juiciest details about May's grandfather. She again brings up the unions, says that there used to be community centers for their membership to gather. And when one of the abusive bosses showed up in his fancy car, May's grandfather, in a drunken burst of rebellion, slashed the tires on that car, broke the windshield, and then unleashed a stream of special Borowski lemonade through the hole he'd made. She then goes on to say that he fled from the scene through an alleyway with Miss Rosa at his side until they reached a field. Then, one thing led to another, and May's grandfather and Miss Rosa ended up making peace between cats and dogs in a rather literal sense. May starts to ask whether or not her grandfather was married to her grandmother at the time, and though Miss Rosa doesn't answer, her silence speaks volumes. Ultimately, she says it was just one wild night in a lifetime of many her grandfather experienced back in his heyday. Before we go on, let's unpack this a little bit. I've seen speculation that this tryst, coupled with the fact that Miss Rosa saw May so soon after she was born, indicates that her and May's grandfather had an ongoing affair, or that the marriage between May's grandfather and her grandmother was an unhappy one. I am the king of overanalysis here on this channel, and all of you know that, but I just don't get that vibe here at all. To me, the point of this story is to emphasize that May's grandfather was once a young person just like May, doing crimes and standing up to the powers that be. Sexual liaison and a field aside, everything May's grandfather does in Miss Rosa's story sounds like something May herself would do. And as I see it, that's the message the developers are trying to get across here, that May and her grandfather are incredibly similar people. But back to the state of May's grandfather's marriage, we can pretty safely conclude that Miss Rosa's story did take place while he was with her grandmother. Based on Miss Rosa's reaction, they were almost certainly married, engaged, or at least dating when they did crimes, and each other. But we know nothing beyond that. May's grandmother isn't really even a character. She's barely mentioned at all. So while it's possible that their marriage wasn't great, I don't think we can say that for sure. He definitely cheated on her, which is decidedly not cool. But as Miss Rosa herself says, it was just one night in a life of many. Based on this, I doubt it was an ongoing affair, but rather a one-off thing that happened on one drunken night after synchronizing with their rebellious Union ancestors. Regardless, this is Miss Rosa's final appearance in Night in the Woods, as she disappears from the game a full 4 days before the climax. I've seen some folks speculate that this could be a sign that she's a member of the cult, but I doubt it. Miss Rosa references the strong Union and pro-labor roots of Possum Springs in several of her stories, the diametric opposite of the cult, and speaks fondly of her grandfather's rebellious deeds, something a cult member certainly wouldn't do. I think the far more likely reason for her disappearance is that she had simply served her narrative purpose. She told May all of her stories about her grandfather, and thus didn't need to show up in the trolley tunnel area anymore. Plus, she's pretty old, guys. Like, really old. She's probably better off resting at home, which I'm willing to bet is what she's doing on days 9 through 12. Now that we've reviewed the events of the game, let's consider the narrative and thematic purpose all of this serves. First, as I discussed heavily in my video about May's grandfather, all of this, the stories about him being a troublemaker, his pro-union leanings, his angry outbursts, and even his low moods are all about aligning him with May. It turns him from just a relative she looked up to into someone who is very much like her. Someone who fought many of the same battles, both against mental illness and the forces trying to manipulate and abuse the working-class citizens of Possum Springs. For him, it was the union-busting bosses. For her, it's the murder cult. Again, as I've said elsewhere, it adds a generational weight to the events of the game. In the OG version of Night in the Woods, all of this is implied. The introduction of Miss Rosa makes it implicit. At the same time, in a broader sense, Miss Rosa's stories humanize May's grandfather. For much of May's life, she's viewed him as something of a hero or a mythological character. A fully formed figure without a past, who never struggled with anything or made mistakes. It's easy to fall into this type of trap with relatives or mentors, but it's important to remember that this is never truly the case. As May's dad puts it, some minor events of history did happen before you were born. Your parents and grandparents had a life before you. Hopes, dreams, doubts, and regrets. They were young too once, and probably did plenty of stupid shit. Maybe even the same stupid shit as you. Miss Rosa, above and beyond anything else, is a reminder of this. That the relatives we often idolize are viewed as complete were once just everyday folks trying to make it in the world, the same way May's grandfather is in her stories. May's grandfather died before he could pass on these tales himself, but fortunately, his old friend is there to fill in for him. And that's what makes Miss Rosa so important to Night in the Woods. Thanks for watching. Huge thanks to Wolf.Godwin and Jordi Jaen Moreno, who provided the music for these videos and the art for my channel. To check out both of these incredibly talented creators, just follow the link down below in the description box. Big shout out to all my silver and gold tier YouTube channel members and Patreon subscribers, including James Pruitt, Hori Matson, Gustavo Balabi, Little Caesar, Reed, and Pathonian, who get early access to these videos thanks to donations of $5 to $10 a month. See you guys next time!